Well, hello and welcome to the third part of our series called Blessed. In this series, I've been talking about how the kingdom relates to finances and how the finances are part of the training ground of our faith. And the key to plugging into the kingdom is to understand and apply the spiritual laws that God's given us for how it operates. Now, round here at the moment, just outside my house, there's lots of farm fields and it's harvest time. Now just imagine if it was harvest time and the local farmer, he got out of bed, and when harvest time arrives, he cleans off all his harvesting equipment, he orders the trucks to take away all his sugar beet and rapeseed and all the rest of it. He starts his engine to go out to his fields expecting to bring in a bumper harvest, and there's nothing there. And the reason there's nothing there is that at the last season he never planted any seed. And God's financial system operates in the same way, in that he gives us a small seed which we then sow. And in sowing that seed, we apply our faith and expect God to give us a harvest so that we can plant even more seed. It's kind of a virtuous circle. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 10, he says this: "Now may he who supplies seeds to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness." Now God knows that isn't easy. He knows it can be tough to do those things, especially when you don't have very much to give. And many people sow when they discover this. They sow in the midst of tears, and they sow in the midst of stress, and they sow in the midst of pressure. But God's encouraging us to trust him. Go with me and we'll see that in Psalm 126, Psalm 126. And I'm reading from verse 5. "Those who sow in tears will reap in joy. He who continually goes forth weeping, bearing seed for sowing, shall doubtless, without doubt, come back again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves of harvest with him." Now, in that you can see the law, what's called the law of sowing and reaping in action. And we can see that in all parts of our life. It's not just about finances, it's in all the areas of our life. Whatever we sow into, whatever we give of ourselves, our time, our effort, our emotion, our care, then God promises that we will reap the same. It's a kingdom principle. Remember, one of the things that Jesus did with his disciples is that he was trying to teach them how the kingdom worked. And it doesn't work like the world. When we sow, we will get a harvest. When we give into the kingdom of our time, efforts and so on, we will see a result coming back to us that is the same as we've sown. And what that means is that every action or decision or priority we have in our life actually has a consequence. Even deciding to do nothing has consequences. For instance, if I decide that, how can I put it? If I decide not to give my wife a card or flowers or chocolates, or, well, perhaps not chocolates for her birthday, or our wedding anniversary, then it's pretty easy to make the leap to see that I wouldn't be too popular and I would reap something that I wasn't really expecting as a consequence. God says this in Galatians 6 verse 7. He says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap." Now, he goes on to say in another letter, 2 Corinthians 9:6. Well, let's turn over to that. 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 6. Almost back to where we started with this session. "But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully." Some translations say, "He who sows generously will also reap generously." And he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. So it's like an equation. It's a kingdom principle. Now, having said all that, what I want to talk about for the rest of this session is a word that we sometimes avoid, and in some ways it's become controversial, and it shouldn't be. And that word is tithing. Now, on a simple level, for those who don't know this, tithing means giving 10% of our income. And in doing that, we don't have to become fearful, but we've got to recognise that God is our source of all things, and we've got to trust him to provide. So just like that principle of sowing and reaping, tithing is an application of that. And it works by faith, and it's to encourage us to trust in God. Remember, God's training us through the way we relate to our finances to grow in faith and grow in trust with him for bigger things. Let's see what God said about tithing and what that's about. Let's go with me to an Old Testament section initially, Malachi chapter 3. And I'm going to read from verse 10. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. And test me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such a blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. Now, when I encounter a chapter or a verse like that, one of the things that I challenge myself to do is saying, do I really believe that? Do I believe that if I give to God, if I bring my tithe or bring what I sow into the storehouse, then God will pour out a blessing in return? Now, I want to relate that to how we deal with that as New Covenant believers. But first of all, I want us to see some principles that apply here. The first thing is that under either the Old Covenant or the New Covenant, tithing is a choice that you make. Under grace, it's not a rule. It is beneficial and it is key to receiving God's best, but it's not a rule. It's a way of allowing him to bless us and for us to bless the kingdom. The second principle is this, that it's about giving. It's a sign that we're putting our trust in God and putting him first in our life before other things. And thirdly, you remember that word, bring your tithe into the storehouse. It keeps the storehouse full. Now, what's the storehouse? Well, in the Old Testament, they used to bring all their grain and fruit and meats and so on, the first fruits of their harvest. They used to bring it into the temple, the storehouse of the temple, and that was part of the distribution system by which the work of God went on and the people who had needs were looked after. In the New Covenant, the storehouse is the church, but more importantly, it's the place where you were fed. Now, I accept that for some people, sadly, that isn't always their church, that they are fed by other ministries or other people. But I want to challenge you to really think about how you can support your local church and the local body that you're part of. Because primarily that is the place where you're fed, it's the place that you looked after, and that is where we bring our tithes. Now, whenever I talk about tithes or whether I look about tithes, there's a particular word that comes up for me, which is this, test. And in the remainder of this session, I'm going to talk about two tests that we see in Scripture. And both relate to this subject of tithing or giving. And the first test we saw in that verse, it's actually God saying, test me on this. See if you give, won't I do this? Won't I keep my promises? And God's telling us to test him on his promises. Now, I find that astonishing that God is so faithful and true and caring and loving and so consistent that he's prepared for like somebody like me or like you to actually test him, to see if it works. And he's not bothered about that. He's not offended by that. He's not angry about that. In fact, he's happy about that and he's encouraging it. And I just think that's amazing. And he says that because he wants to give us things and he wants to get blessing to us. And so he's encouraging us to give to him, to test his heart and see how much he will bless us in return. Literally, he says, I'm going to inundate you with blessings. I'm going to open the windows of heaven and inundate and pour out blessings upon you. Now, I accept that Malachi chapter 3, that's in the Old Testament. It's still at that time under covenant of law. It's not under the new covenant. And we're under a covenant of grace, not law. Now, what that means for us is that tithing isn't mandatory. There is no rule that says you have to do this or God's going to be upset with you. That's not how grace works. God isn't going to stop loving you if you don't tithe. And he's not going to be angry with you if you don't tithe. But tithing is a good idea. Tithing is a good level to pitch and to be consistent in our giving. And we'll see in a minute how that works itself out under the new covenant of grace and faith. Firstly, what I want you to see is that tithing is God's idea. Now, many of you will know that tithing came in with Moses. The law came in with Moses, and that tithing is part, in Malachi, we're under that covenant of law. However, tithing isn't part necessarily of the covenant of law. And the reason I say that is that it existed long before Moses. Right at the beginning, we see, even with Cain and Abel, we see that one of them brought an offering into God that was the first fruits of his crop. But the other brought something that was the leftovers. And God was unhappy with the leftovers, but happy with the one who brought the first fruits in. And so we see that even before there was the law, there was this principle of grace and this principle of giving, and giving of our first fruits, the first part, the first 10%. Now, a little bit later on, we see that also come into effect with Abraham. Abraham had, he got into trouble again because of Lot. Lot had gone to live in Sodom. Sodom had been raided. They'd taken Lot's family off into captivity, and they'd basically taken all the possessions of that great city of the time. And Abraham, who by that time God was blessing immensely, took all these hundreds of servants and he chased those captors and he defeated them and released his family from captivity. But he also brought back all the finances and all the property. And out of what God gave him, he took that to a priest called Melchizedek and gave his tithe. Again, we see tithing before the law ever existed. Tithing is independent of the law. Now, again, what I'll say is that under grace, God's not upset with you, and he's not going to not love you if you don't tithe. But at the same time, he doesn't love you anymore because you do more than tithe. Tithing is a good benchmark, and it is a God idea that we see right through Scripture, not just under covenants of law, but also under the covenant of grace. Okay, so the principle is this: God doesn't love us any more or any less based on what we do with our finances. But it does have an effect. Where we put our trust is ultimately what we must live by. Now let me say that again. God doesn't love us any more or any less based on what we do with our finances. But it does have an effect. It has an effect on us. Where we put our trust is ultimately what we must live by. Actually, one of the things that you discover when you do read the law, and going back to that verse in Malachi chapter 3, just immediately before that, we find that God refers to not just tithes, but to offerings. And under the old covenant, people didn't just tithe, but they gave offerings on top of that. Some believe that the devout believers of that time gave somewhere between 30 and 35% of their total income in the tithe and the offerings. And so that's certainly quite different from our experience today. Now let me come on to the second test, because that first one, that's a test for God. But this second test is about where we are. It's about where our heart is, where we're putting our trust. And out of that, one of the things that we discover is that the motive for our giving is vital. It's not just about giving, it's about how we give. And under the new covenant, God really gets excited when we give from what he calls a cheerful heart, or a willing heart, or a joyful heart. And the dominant motive for giving shouldn't be so we can get something or because we're following a rule. The dominant motive for giving is because we want to. We want to be a blessing to others. We want to contribute to the work of the kingdom. We want to see the kingdom grow. We want to see other people saved, coming into the kingdom. We want to see people set free. We want to see people delivered. We want to see people healed. And we give because we want to contribute, because we want to be part of that, because we want to partner in it and share in it. And because our motives are so important, that's why God calls our attitude to money and giving a test of our heart. What we do with money is a test of our love for God and for others. And it's a test of our trust in him. Now let me show you that. Let's go with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 8. I speak not by commandment, but I am testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. Now, what's happening there is that's in the middle of a passage about giving. And Paul is saying, well, compared to another church, a church that was relatively poor, I want to see you being generous, because I want to know that your heart is soft and your heart is trusting in God. So he's saying this giving issue is a test of your heart. It's a test of what's going on inside. Now, in that, then we can take the idea of a tithe as a starting point for our giving. Ultimately, as your trust in God goes, you could be cheerful about giving a whole lot more. But either way, your freedom to give more and trust God with all your provision as he blesses you is really freeing. It's really liberating. I discovered that a number of years ago. The business that I was involved in, we were basically an amalgam of a lot of different businesses, a lot of different service lines. And one of the things that had happened over the years is that we built up a significant business in the area of outsourcing, which wasn't really core to the rest of the activities we had. And when it got to a certain size, we decided to sell it, and all the partners in the business shared in the profits of that sale. And I remember at the time, and this might sound crazy now as I relate it, but this was just where I was at the time. I remember thinking, well, this is a lot of money, and this isn't really income. This is capital. This is like, I've already given out of the money that was invested, so this is a return on money that I've already given from. And I remember like really battling with myself and thinking, well, do I have to really give out of this? Do I have to tithe out of this? And I remember it going on for quite some weeks, thinking, it's a lot of money. I'm not sure I ever reconciled at that time in my head the way that I've been talking in this session, how it all fit together. But I got to the point where I thought, well, I was just unhappy, uneasy inside. I wasn't cheerful. I wasn't thinking like I'm really happy with where I've landed on this decision. And so I decided that whether I was right or wrong, whether I needed to give it or not because it was capital and not income and so on, whether there was an obligation to give it or not, I was going to give anyway. And so I gave this sum of money, and I gave it into the church that I was part of at that time. And they used it to create a whole new job for a year, which sort of gives you a sense of how significant that sum was. And I thought, well, that's great, and that's brilliant. But then a few weeks later, what happened, and bearing in mind that the business I was involved with is an accountancy firm and consulting firm, and I was a tax specialist, I got a letter telling me I was due a tax refund. Now, I have no idea how that happened or how that conclusion was reached, because as far as I can see and as far as our tax department could see, each year my tax is checked out and I'd paid the right amount. But anyway, the Inland Revenue were absolutely convinced I was due a refund, and they sent me a refund. And the amazing thing is that to the exact amount, the amount of the refund was the amount that I had given into the church. And so, what do you do in that situation? Well, I tithed again out of the refund. I wasn't going to be caught out a second time. So anyway, I just tell that story as a bit of an illustration, because even though I didn't necessarily have everything worked out, when my heart was cheerful about it, I gave, and God was faithful. We don't give to please God or to get him to bless us. He's already pleased with us and he already wants to bless us. We tithe and we give so our heart is soft and trusts God. Under the old covenant, they used to give in order to get, but we've got a better covenant than that. We give because we're responding to the love of God and we want to share in the work that he has. Sometimes I refer to that as we are graced to give. And there's a difference between grace-based giving and law-based giving. Paul said that grace-based giving is always a reflex action to the love of God. It's not an obligation, it's a reaction to how much God loves us. And it's a reaction to that love in which we put our trust in him because we know he cares for us. And under the new covenant, giving in that respect, Paul advises us that it's proportional. He doesn't use this word tithe, but he does use the word proportional. Go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 2. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay aside something, storing up as you prosper, that there may be no collections when I come. So what he's advising to them to do is to store up or save up for the collection as income comes in, a proportion of that income, so that they don't have to be put under pressure all at the last minute when it's offering time. You see, Jesus is not so much interested in how much you give, he's much more interested in why and how you give. He's interested in, do you love him? Do you trust him? Just to finish off with this session, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Again, we're talking about that offering concept. Paul is putting these verses right in the middle of a section on giving and collecting funds to help needy churches. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and I'll begin at verse 2. And he's talking about the churches in Macedonia, that in a great deal of trial and affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us or begging us with much urgency that we would receive the gift they brought, and the fellowship, and that they could partake in the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord, and then to us by the will of God. Now we can see some really great principles from that I want to finish with here. The first thing is this: cheerful, willing giving is powerful. It's powerful because it changes your heart. Remember, they first gave of themselves. Their hearts were already changed. And that was because they were generous. They were willing to give. They'd followed these principles that Paul had set out. The second thing is this: when you trust God enough to give, you demonstrate the sincerity of your love for him and for others. And thirdly, when you do that, you position yourself to receive a blessing. Not because you've earned the blessing, but because your heart is soft and trusting God and puts you in a place so that you can receive. And finally, And finally, I guess in this whole series, you change lives by blessing others. So I want to encourage you right at the end of this series to take away that and resolve in your heart that you are going to trust God, and that you resolve that when he blesses you, you are blessed to be a blessing.